Hey folks, in this final video from chapter 17, we deal with stress and health. The first question, of course, is what the heck stress is, and it's important to differentiate stress from anxiety. These are closely related terms, but they're not quite the same thing. Sometimes we use them interchangeably. Stress specifically involves physiological responses. Okay? It's going to be physiological responses to harm or threat. Anxiety is going to be fear that persists in the absence of any direct threat. Okay? So if there's no direct threat to my person, and I'm, for example, worrying about a future threat, I would call that anxiety, right? That's real. Anxiety is real. That's the term for that fear that we're having. Now, a stress is going to be a physiological response to harm or threat. Okay. Now it gets complicated because anxiety, sort of experiencing anxiety and simulating a future threat or ruminating about a past threat or harm, right, can lead to a stress response, right? But the stress response is the physiological response. McEwen proposed a few terms that you might be familiar with in terms of stress. Is the stressor, the individual, and coping strategies. Right? So a stress response, that physiological response, is going to depend on the stressor itself, so that the experience that induces stress, some experiences are going to be more stressful than others. The individual, so different people's biology, different people's development, different people's experience, right, over their lifetime might make them more or less susceptible. They might change their stress response to the same stressor, right? The same stressor, we have a different stress response for different people. And then there's strategies to cope. These are behavioral differences, learned behavioral differences that we have in terms of how we cope with that stressor. There's a number of different strategies for coping, including humor and prayer and problem solving and alcohol use, any number of strategies to cope, right? So my stress response, my physiological reaction, is going to depend on the stressor itself, on individual differences in terms of my biology and my development, and then on differences in terms of coping strategies. So what's going on physiologically if stress is a physiological response? Well, there's two tracks. One track is going to start in the endocrine system that we talked about earlier in this semester through the anterior pituitary gland, right? So the brain, specifically the last route out of the brain is going to be the hypothalamus, right? Is going to signal the anterior pituitary, which is going to send a hormone response down to my adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are right above your kidneys, which are going to set off glucocorticoids. These is like cortisol. Okay, so you're going to have a hormone response, hormone-based response to stress that's ultimately going to lead to cortisol release or another glucocorticoids. I'm going to have a faster response that happens on the other track through my nervous system, right? So I'm going to send signals from my brain to my sympathetic nervous system. That's like increasing your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your breathing, right? Increasing your pupil dilation, that sort of thing. That sympathetic nervous system is going to then stimulate my adrenal medulla, a different part of my adrenal gland, and I'm going to get epinephrine and norepinephrine release. Okay, so this is that adrenaline release. Okay, so I've got a nervous system response that's going to be as fast as your action potentials can go, down to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then I'm going to have a slower hormonal response, which is going to go as fast as your blood can carry the hormones, which is ultimately going to lead to glucocorticoids. Now, our book mentions this two-track system. To complicate it just a little bit, this word here is stress. Stress also leads to the release of cytokines from your immune system. So we also get an immune system response. So you could also think of that as a third track. Okay, so slow hormone release that leads to cortisol, fast nervous system release that leads to epinephrine or adrenaline. It's the same thing. How do we know this? Well, we can study stress in humans, but it can be unethical to induce stress in humans. So people have tried to induce extreme stress in animals to study the physiological responses. So, for example, putting animals in under threat, constant threat of harm, right, induces stress, and they can change the amount of time that they're under stress and measure the physiological effects. Now, there are ethical issues with that as well. A lot of people question whether putting animals under that much stress is ethical. The animals do die from the stress response eventually. And there's also some questionable scientific value of that kind of stress, as it may not replicate real-world stressors. So a common model that people use occurs in hierarchical animals that will naturally organize themselves around social hierarchies. So monkeys and chimps will oftentimes have hierarchies, and some individuals in the lower rungs of the hierarchy will experience what's known as subordination stress, which is similar to the effects of bullying, right? So higher hierarchy animals will bully or subordinate lower hierarchy animals, and that leads to a stress response. It leads to that two-track system of stress response, and you can look at the long-term effects of stress in those animals. Okay? And what we see in those animals is that more stress comes with negative effects on the lifespan, decreased testosterone levels in males, and then increased levels of glucocorticoids like cortisol, and then behavioral changes like aggression toward juveniles. So these subordinated animals who, when they weren't subordinated, they get put in a community and they become subordinated, right? Things change, right? So you get changes to the lifespan, testosterone levels, cortisol levels, and behaviors like aggression. So we can study stress in these kinds of somewhat natural hierarchies. So let's look at this in humans, right? So if stress has negative physiological effects on chimpanzees, presumably stress might have negative health effects for humans. And this could fall into a category of disorders called psychosomatic disorders. Psychosomatic disorders are illnesses that have a physical basis, so all illnesses have physical basis to them, but are greatly influenced by psychological factors. So psychosomatic doesn't mean made up or imagined. It just means that it's influenced by psychological factors. Gastric ulcers are a great example of this. So gastric ulcers are painful lesions to the lining of the stomach and the small intestine. Bacteria causes the ulcers, so there's a physiological cause, but the bacteria only has its effect under certain stress-enhanced conditions. So stress-induced stomach acid secretions combine with a particular bacteria leads to ulcers, right? So stress causes ulcers by activating bacteria, right? So there's a physiological mechanism through bacteria, and there's a psychological enhancement through stress responses. Okay, so this is a psychosomatic disorder, and it's a real one. Ulcers are pretty bad. A broader field that deals with some psychosomatic disorders, but also a broader idea about stress and health is psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the interactions among psychological factors, the nervous system, and the immune system. You probably have some idea of what the immune system is, right? It's our barriers against pathogens, barriers against things that'll make us sick, right? Some of our immune system is innate. You don't have to know all of these details, right? But we have an inflammatory response, cytokines, white blood cells, phagocytes. These generally work to fight off pathogens, right? They fight off viruses and bacteria. And then there's adaptive ones, specific antigens, lymphocytes, T cells, and B cells that are more recently evolved and more specific to a specific pathogen. Okay, so this is your immune system, right? And what we're dealing here with psychoneuroimmunology is a suggestion that maybe factors like stress could influence your immune system in ways that might change our susceptibility to disease. And there's been a lot of research on this relationship between stress and the immune system and disease. And first of all, we should be clear that it's not just a simple correlation. So it's not just the case that more stress is more bad. In fact, a little bit of stress, acute stress, actually improves immune system activity. But chronic stress over long periods of time impairs immune system activity and impairs health. Okay? So something like a pop quiz might give you stress in the moment and then will fade. That sort of momentary acute stress can actually boost your immune system activity a little bit and help your health. But if you have anxiety over schoolwork and work interfering with each other over the course of weeks and months, right, that could be something that could impair your health. Now, how does this work, right? So chronic stress impairs immune function, potentially by affecting the immune system itself. So a lot of immune cells, like the ones we talked about, T cells, B cells, phagocytes, white blood cells, that sort of thing, have receptors for stress, okay, for stress hormones, right? So like cortisol and that sort of thing will actually connect to the immune system and change responses, okay, making the immune system less effective. There's also the case that stress can lead to behavioral changes, right? So it might not be a direct effect of stress on your immune system, but stress can make behavioral changes as we cope. Remember, coping strategies, right? So changes to diet, changes to exercise, sleep, drug use, those sorts of things, right? If those are part of our coping strategies for stress, then those could affect our immune system, which would then have the downstream effect on disease. So let's look at the actual evidence here, right? Does stress actually influence health? Well, mainly we've got correlational studies on this, right? Correlations have been established between chronic stress and measures of health pretty strongly. Human correlational studies confirm that the relationship exists. So chronic stress, not acute stress from a single pop quiz, but chronic stress and health issues have a positive correlation. More stress, more health issues. Chronic stress and lifespan, just how long you live, have a negative correlation. More stress, lower lifespan. More chronic stress. Laboratory experiments with animals suggest that this is causal, that the stress, if we induce it experimentally, causes changes to health. And then there's a small number of human experiments that have actually been done on this, where they've experimentally exposed people to a cold virus, okay, and then tested whether somebody got the virus or not, depending on stress induction. Okay, putting people under mild chronic stress and exposing them to a cold, and people who were experimentally induced stress and the cold virus were more likely to get the cold than people who were under less stress. So it does seem real, right? So either by directly affecting our immune system or by affecting coping strategies that then have effects on our immune system, chronic stress, not acute stress, but chronic stress has a negative effect on immune system and on health. The other thing to talk about this is as we think about development, right? And your brain is plastic and changing as we develop. And as you know, early experiences can be pivotal. Severe stress during development can adversely affect brain development. This is both prenatal stress, so before you're born, and early childhood events. One of the things that can happen is that some experiences can sensitize us to future stress, right? So if I have early stress, right, that can make me more sensitive to stress later on, so my stress responses might be stronger later on in life. and then I might experience a higher physiological reaction to stressful events just naturally through experience. Some of this is mediated through cortisol or other glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. Right? So the hippocampus, where we form new memories, has receptors for stress chemicals like cortisol. And so if I experience a lot of cortisol while I'm building up early memories, and my hippocampus is highly plastic and changeable, right? I can get changes to my hippocampus, which can affect how I learn in the future. And this is one of the mediating mechanisms for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Traumatic events lead to cortisol release. Cortisol release affects my hippocampus. Then later, my memories of those traumatic events may be different and colored by the stress that I experience. Of course, as we talk about all this, remember that complex psychology is not just, caused by one factor alone. So stress, and even early childhood stress, does influence our health and psychological well-being. There is an effect there. But a stressful experience doesn't guarantee a specific outcome. Development isn't one event and doesn't end in childhood. It's much more dynamic. And remember that you and your brain are plastic and resilient. That's it for chapter 17. We got one more chapter to go in the class. Looking forward to talking about the next one.